It began with a sentence drifting from the upstairs room, as casual as a cough. "She's just my free maid." 4 years into his supposed paralysis, those words landed not like a blow, but like a slow poison, something small and ordinary that I knew would unravel me, given enough time. I was folding towels in the hallway when I heard him. David's voice, light, amused, speaking to someone I didn't recognize, floated down with the ease of someone entirely unburdened. My hands didn't stop moving. Muscle memory took over. Fold in thirds, roll, stack. But something in me had gone cold. Not because he was speaking, though the doctors had insisted he wouldn't. Not even because he was speaking clearly, fluently, with no sign of the damage they'd described. What stopped me cold was the content of it. The ease. The certainty. "She's just my free maid." I didn't go upstairs. I didn't confront him. I didn't ask who she was, though I could guess. I simply walked back into the laundry room, set the towels down on the counter, and stood very still. The sound of his laughter, soft, like an old friend's, trailed behind that sentence and stayed with me long after the house went quiet. "Let me know how you'd like me to adjust this before we move to the next part." The years before that moment had been full of a kind of devotion that people don't talk about anymore. Not the loud kind that shows up in movies or the kind measured in grand gestures. Mine had been quiet, deliberate. The kind that unfolds one careful choice at a time. I remember thinking, during the first few months of David's illness, that this was what love looked like when it matured, when it was stripped of romance and ceremony and asked to prove itself in the dark. When he came home from the hospital, I rearranged the entire downstairs to make it easier for him to get around. We installed ramps, widened doorways, swapped out the heavy dining chairs for ones with arms and rubber feet. I gave up our bedroom and moved us into the den, since the stairs were no longer an option. At the time, I didn't see any of it as sacrifice. I saw it as responsibility. As the natural extension of vows that had once felt ceremonial and now suddenly felt binding in the most real way possible. I left my job 3 months after the accident. It wasn't really a decision, not one I considered reversible. David couldn't manage on his own, and the cost of full-time care was staggering. I'd worked in publishing most of my adult life, deadlines, contracts, the quiet thrill of turning raw manuscripts into finished stories. I liked the work. I was good at it. But it didn't make sense anymore. We told ourselves it would be temporary, just until he stabilized. That word, temporary, became a mantra. A way to dress permanence in clothing we could both tolerate. At first, I filled my days with purpose. Medication charts, therapy schedules, meal prep, coordination with home health aides. I made binders. Color-coded everything. I learned the stretch and hold sequences the therapists used and practiced them until my hands knew his body better than he did. The nurses would tell me I was a natural. That most wives didn't get so involved, didn't stick around for every appointment. I'd smile and say something about being thorough, but the truth was simpler, I couldn't imagine leaving. When his speech faltered, I worked with him for hours. We'd sit at the table with flashcards and homemade workbooks. I would read the same children's book to him that I'd once read to our son, simple words, clear phonetics, and celebrate when he could repeat a sentence back to me. I kept a notebook of his progress. It had hearts and stickers on the pages, not because I thought it was cute but because I needed the encouragement too. There were setbacks. Infections. Days where his muscles refused to cooperate. Swells of bitterness that leaked into our conversations, usually at night when he was tired and I was stretched thin. He once asked me, very calmly, if I ever missed being touched. I didn't answer. I just adjusted his pillows and turned off the light. In the morning, we never spoke of it again. I let go of little things gradually. Lunches with friends. Book club. My standing appointment at the salon. When people stopped calling, I didn't blame them. What would I even say? That my days had collapsed into care routines and nights into shallow sleep with one ear trained to his breathing? Still, I found a rhythm. There's a kind of peace in knowing what each hour demands. Breakfast at 8. Medication at 9. Exercises at 10. By the time I got to folding laundry or sweeping the front porch, my mind was so full of tasks that it didn't have space for resentment. Or at least that's what I told myself. Our son, Mark, called once a week. Sundays at 5:30. It was always brief. He'd ask how we were doing, mention something about work or the kids. I never told him much. I didn't want pity. I didn't want advice. Mostly, I didn't want to hear the faint relief in his voice when I told him we were managing. David had been different before the stroke. Not soft, exactly, but steady. Reliable. He wasn't a man who brought flowers or wrote notes, but he paid bills on time and remembered anniversaries and took care of the yard without being asked. He built me a garden trellis one year, on a Saturday when I'd mentioned in passing that I missed the one from my childhood home. He could be sharp sometimes. Quietly judgmental. But I knew how to soften those edges. We understood each other. That's why I never hesitated, not really. When the hospital discharge papers were handed over, when the doctor explained the prognosis in those flattened clinical tones, I nodded. I would take him home. I would care for him. I would do what needed to be done. I converted our savings into something more flexible, opened joint accounts, paid off outstanding debts, made sure everything was simple, streamlined. I trusted David completely. He wasn't the kind of man to leave things messy. He'd always kept meticulous notes, files, spreadsheets. Our finances were stable, though not extravagant. The house was paid off. We had enough, as long as we were careful. And I was always careful. What I didn't realize then was how easily careful can turn into small. Into invisible. I began to forget how to speak about myself in ways that didn't orbit around David. People would ask how I was doing and I'd give updates on his muscle tone, his appetite, his sleep. I couldn't remember the last time I answered that question with something personal. I couldn't remember the last time I felt like a person with separate contours. But I didn't resent him. I want that to be clear. This isn't one of those stories where love curdles into hatred over time. I loved David. I believed he was doing his best. I believed that what we had was something worth holding on to, even if the shape of it had changed. I believed, deeply, in loyalty. In showing up. In staying. Always staying. So when I heard that sentence drift down the stairs, I didn't know how to absorb it. It didn't fit into the narrative I'd so carefully constructed. David, amused. David, speaking fluently. David, calling me his free maid. The words didn't feel like betrayal yet. More like a misfire. Like something spoken in error that could be explained away. Except they weren't. Because the longer I stood there, frozen in the hallway, the more the rest of it began to surface. The tiny cracks I'd noticed over the past year, odd bank charges, slips in his posture, moments when his fatigue seemed too convenient, all began to form a pattern. And patterns, once you see them, don't disappear. They become maps. The sentence lingered, but it didn't detonate. It eroded. Quietly. Patiently. Over the following weeks, I found myself remembering things I hadn't paused over before. The way David's hands had started resting differently on the armrests of his chair, less limp, more deliberate. The subtle but repeated refusal to have guests, especially those who'd known him before the stroke. How easily he dismissed phone calls on the pretext of being too tired, only to seem curiously alert minutes later. There were moments when he'd reach for something, a napkin, the remote, a water glass, and then stop himself mid-motion, as if remembering he wasn't supposed to. It had felt like reflex before. Now it felt like rehearsal. Once, I'd stepped into the room quicker than he expected and seen him adjusting the pillow under his legs. With both hands. Naturally, efficiently. But the second he registered my presence, the left hand slumped. He blinked, confused, as if unsure what I'd seen. I didn't say anything. I just picked up the dropped newspaper and placed it back in his lap. He nodded thanks, and we moved on. But I had seen it. And I didn't forget. I started watching him differently. Not with suspicion, not yet, but with a kind of sharpened interest I hadn't allowed myself in years. I began to notice that his bad days often aligned with the days I'd arranged for help, the nurse from the agency, the physical therapist. On those days, he slurred his words more. He let his face droop, his limbs sag. He performed. Because that's what it was beginning to feel like, a performance. I felt disloyal thinking it. And the feeling of betrayal, strangely, wasn't directed at him but at myself. I'd let the story I believed in, the one I'd repeated to every doctor, every visitor, every friend who'd called to check in, become my only reality. I'd repeated the script so long, I hadn't thought to question its accuracy. One night, I went to bed before him, a rare thing, but I was tired and he said he wanted to finish watching a documentary. At some point past midnight, I woke to a thump. Not loud, but distinct. A sound out of place. I sat up, listening. Silence. Then, faintly, the sound of movement. Not dragging or stumbling, but the kind of measured footsteps that come from someone trying not to be heard. I got up quietly, eased the door open. The hallway was dark. The living room light was off. But the kitchen light, the small one under the cabinet, was on. I moved slowly, barefoot, making no noise on the hardwood floor. And there he was. David, standing at the kitchen counter, pouring himself a glass of milk. He was steady on his feet, balanced, no visible tremor in his hands. He turned slightly, reached for the tin of biscuits I kept on the top shelf, the shelf I'd stopped using because he couldn't reach it from the wheelchair. My breath caught, not from fear or even surprise, but from the absolute certainty that this was not new. This was not his first time standing in that kitchen. This was habit. Routine. I stepped back into the shadows before he saw me. Returned to bed without a sound. My heart pounded against my ribs like a guilty thing. I lay in the dark, staring at the ceiling, waiting for the creak of the mattress or the whir of the chair. Neither came. When I finally heard him moving again, it was the familiar soft rumble of wheels on carpet. He came back to the den like nothing had happened. The next morning, I made his breakfast the way I always did. Porridge with berries. Black coffee, 1 sugar. I didn't speak differently. Didn't look at him longer than necessary. I kissed the top of his head when I set the tray down. He smiled, thanked me, and asked about the paper. It was a normal morning. I began to keep notes. Quietly. A little red notebook I tucked behind the gardening gloves in the hall closet. I recorded dates, times, impressions. Not accusations, just observations. Milk glass, 2:14 a.m. standing, full weight on left leg. Clear speech during phone call with his cousin. Reaches for remote without hesitation. Refused to let me schedule speech therapy, claims it's too exhausting. The more I wrote, the more I saw. The more I saw, the less confused I felt. I began reviewing the medical files, the notes from the neurologist. David had suffered a stroke, yes. There had been damage. But the prognosis had always included the possibility of partial recovery, depending on effort, therapy, consistency. We had followed every recommendation. Or so I thought. He was always too tired for sessions. Or too sore. Or he'd refused to try certain exercises, claiming they didn't help. I had believed he was overwhelmed, depressed, adjusting to a new life. I had bent over backward to accommodate what I thought was trauma. What if it was just preference? What if it was easier to be cared for? That thought sat with me for days. I didn't speak of it to anyone. There was no one I trusted with it, not yet. And even if there were, how could I explain it? That the man I'd bathed and fed and lifted and watched over for 4 years might have chosen that life, not out of necessity, but out of convenience. The betrayal wasn't just in the deception. It was in the intimacy of it. The deliberate allowance of my sacrifice. There were other signs, now that I was watching. Emails he deleted quickly when I walked into the room. A credit card statement that didn't match the receipts I'd saved. The withdrawal of a large sum labeled as home repairs, repairs that had never been scheduled. When I asked him about it, he said it must be an error. I believed him. At least I acted like I did. Because I was still gathering. Still watching. Still trying to understand the full shape of what was happening. One afternoon, while cleaning the upstairs guest room, a space he never had reason to be in, I found a pair of cufflinks on the desk. Not his. Sleeker. Modern. A brand he never wore. There was a faint scent on the pillow. Not perfume. Something subtler, a shampoo, maybe. Floral, expensive. I didn't jump to conclusions. I catalogued. I noted. I made tea and cleaned the bathroom and prepared dinner as usual. Because this wasn't about catching him. It was about waking up. About letting the old narrative dissolve, one assumption at a time. I'd spent 4 years learning to disappear into his needs. 4 years treating my presence as secondary. My name on the mailbox, but my identity tucked behind his prescriptions and preferences. But that was changing now. Slowly. Steadily. And he didn't know it. Because I hadn't stopped being kind. Or attentive. I hadn't changed the way I touched his shoulder when I walked past or the way I laughed at his dry jokes. I hadn't moved out of the den or stopped folding his clothes just the way he liked. The performance, as he knew it, remained intact. But the audience had changed. The decision didn't come with fireworks. No angry confrontation, no slammed doors or shaking hands. It was born in silence, like most of my important decisions. It formed slowly, over weeks, during the quietest parts of my day, in the rhythm of stirring soup, or when I trimmed the dead leaves off the ficus by the front window. It came while I sat at the foot of our bed, folding socks. While I rinsed his toothbrush, set out his pills, wiped the fog from the bathroom mirror. It was a decision shaped by noticing. I would no longer be the unmoving fixture in his carefully arranged life. I would shift. Begin to reclaim the weight of my presence. Not loudly, not all at once, just enough that the center of gravity began to tilt back toward me. I started with the safe. The one he kept in the upstairs closet, behind the winter coats and a stack of dusty board games we hadn't touched since our son moved out. I'd always known the combination, David had shown me years ago, after a small break-in in our old neighborhood. I'd never had reason to open it since. Inside were bank documents, some old family jewelry, a few letters. At the bottom, a small black notebook. Leather-bound, with David's tidy handwriting on the first page. It was a ledger, dates, transactions, account names. Some I recognized. Some I didn't. I took photos of every page with my old camera, the one we'd bought for our trip to Quebec but hadn't used since. I uploaded them to a USB drive I kept on my keychain, disguised inside a novelty charm. I also began visiting the library again. Not every day, that would be too obvious. Once a week, under the pretense of checking out books or attending a lecture. I used their computers to research account numbers, search for business names listed in David's notes. One account was tied to a shell company registered under a mailing address in another county. Another led to a woman's name I didn't recognize. I didn't jump to conclusions. That wasn't my way anymore. I gathered. I documented. Years in publishing had taught me how to follow a paper trail. How to recognize when something had been rewritten too often, when margins didn't line up, when footnotes didn't match citations. The same instincts served me here. I opened a new bank account at a credit union across town. Small, quiet. I used my maiden name. Had my monthly stipends from the state, part of David's long-term care benefit, redirected there. It wasn't much, but it was enough to begin. I also started logging receipts. Everything that came through the house. Every grocery item, every supply, every medical bill. I began cross-referencing them against our bank statements. Slowly, patterns emerged. Duplicate purchases. Withdrawals listed as reimbursements. Charges that made no sense, meals for two at restaurants I'd never been to, invoices from clinics that hadn't returned any progress reports. I didn't confront him. Because confrontation implies you want a response. I didn't. I wanted clarity. Proof. Foundation. So I played the part. The warm wife, still loyal, still patient. But I began to revise my own internal script. I stopped ending my days exhausted and resigned. I started ending them curious. Intentional. At night, after he'd gone to sleep, I sat in the guest room with a notebook and wrote out timelines. What I knew. What I suspected. What I could prove. I marked the moment I first noticed the cracks. The morning I saw him standing in the kitchen. The afternoon he'd laughed too freely on the phone with someone whose voice I didn't recognize. Each page was a small reclamation. Not of power, exactly. But of self. I didn't need him to confess. I didn't need him to slip up. I only needed to understand the structure of the life he had built, the one I had supported, propped up, justified, and then I could begin to walk out of it. I contacted a private investigator. Through someone I trusted. Quietly. No paper trail in my name. The woman, a former claims auditor named Naomi, was sharp-eyed and discreet. She met me at the back of the pharmacy cafe, where the staff knew me as the sweet lady who came in once a week for decaf and crossword puzzles. Naomi ordered tea and listened carefully. Didn't interrupt. Didn't flinch. He may be hiding money, I told her. Maybe more. She took notes. Asked smart questions. Promised a report in 2 weeks. I paid her in cash, pulled from the stash I'd slowly begun collecting from the household budget. A few dollars here and there. Tucked in envelopes marked for miscellaneous expenses. At home, I began changing my patterns. I told David I wanted to take walks alone in the morning. For my health. He didn't argue. I said I was meeting a neighbor for coffee, the kind of interaction he was happy to avoid. These small freedoms gave me breathing room. I began returning to things I loved. Books I'd put aside. A short story I'd half-written years ago, now pulled from a drawer and reread with new eyes. The act of holding a pen to paper, not a grocery list, not a medication schedule, but something creative, felt almost dangerous. Exhilarating. I also cleaned the study. His study. A room I'd avoided since his stroke. He had insisted it remain untouched, a space too difficult for him to enter, he said. Too many reminders. But it was dusty. And I needed to dust. Inside the desk drawer, under the dividers, I found a flash drive taped to the underside. Password protected, but I had a good guess. The year we met. It worked. Inside, scanned documents, some financial spreadsheets, and a folder of photographs. One of them caught me, David, standing in a small park, smiling. Beside him, a woman. Not young, but younger than me. They were looking at each other. Not like acquaintances. Like something else. I didn't cry. That surprised me. I stared at the photo until my eyes blurred, then saved it to my USB. I closed the files. Returned everything to its place. Finished dusting. I didn't speak of it that night. I made dinner. Set the table. Asked about the sports game he claimed to be following. Smiled at the right moments. Laughed when expected. But inside, I was already elsewhere. Naomi's report arrived on a Thursday. She passed it to me in a manila envelope, her expression unreadable. "There's more than you thought," she said. The summary was concise. 3 undisclosed accounts. 1 in another state. Monthly payments to a woman listed as a care consultant, no business license, no registered address. Hotel receipts. Restaurant charges. All carefully placed to avoid suspicion, but not careful enough. There were emails too. Copies Naomi had managed to access. Messages from David's private account, the one I didn't know existed. Notes with pet names. References to their arrangement. To how lucky he was to have such a generous, trusting wife. I read them twice. Then folded the papers and placed them back in the envelope. I didn't scream. I didn't sob. I didn't throw anything. I cleaned the kitchen. I made the bed. I took a long shower. And when I stepped out, I didn't feel broken. I felt clear. That night, I added a new page to my notebook. Titled it, Exit Plan. Numbered the steps. Underlined the ones I'd already completed. I was almost ready. From that point on, everything became a maneuver. The house, once a place of habit and routine, became a stage where every movement was deliberate. I adjusted my schedule, just slightly. Enough that David could no longer predict the rhythms of my day. I stopped narrating my errands. No more, "I'll be at the market," or "need anything from the pharmacy." Instead, I came and went quietly, sometimes through the back door, sometimes not at all. He noticed, but not immediately. I removed the wall calendar where I used to record appointments, grocery days, deliveries. It fell one afternoon and I simply never replaced it. Without those visual cues, he had to rely on asking. And when he did, I offered vague, pleasant answers. I transferred the contents of Naomi's report to a fireproof lockbox I'd hidden in the linen closet, under a stack of towels nobody had touched in years. Inside were the USB drive, the copies of the bank records, the photographs, the printed emails. Everything labeled, catalogued, sequenced. The kind of order that used to comfort me. Now it served a new purpose, preparation. I kept up the performance of the wife, cheerful, patient, attentive. But each task I performed, each meal I prepared, each night I turned down his blankets, was done with the knowledge that the clock had started ticking. That this wasn't my forever anymore. I found a lawyer. Quietly. Not one of the old family attorneys who'd handled our wills and taxes over the years, someone independent, across town, with no ties to David or anyone who might mention my name casually. Her office was in a modest building behind a florist, discreet and welcoming. Her name was Marcy Cheng, and from the first moment we met, I knew she understood. "You want to separate without alerting him," she said, after reviewing the materials I'd brought. "Not just separate," I replied. "I want to reposition everything. Ownership, access, visibility. I want to be untraceable if I choose to be." Marcy didn't blink. She took notes. She made calls. She pulled documents and outlined timelines. Within a week, she had helped me open a trust in my name only, to which I transferred the small inheritance from my aunt, the remainder of my personal savings, and the pension I'd quietly redirected over the last few months. I also added Naomi's investigative report as part of a legal record, not to file charges yet, but to establish documentation. A foundation, if I ever needed to build higher. One afternoon, while David napped, I scanned the house for any surveillance equipment. Naomi had warned me about that. Men who play helpless often invest in subtle forms of control. I checked smoke detectors, the backs of picture frames, the inside of drawers. In the end, I found nothing. But the search itself changed something in me. I had always believed this house was neutral ground. Now I knew better. I changed my online passwords. Every one of them. Banking, utilities, my email, even my grocery delivery account. I ordered a prepaid phone under an alias and kept it in the car, in a sunglasses case. I began communicating with Marcy and Naomi through encrypted email, only from the library or using the prepaid device. And I started applying for part-time work. Freelance editorial consulting, the kind of thing I used to do before David's stroke, before the walls of this house became both my prison and my purpose. At first, I was rusty. But the muscle memory returned. Slowly, my name began circulating again. Not in big ways, but in the kind that matters: emails forwarded, inquiries made, meetings scheduled. It was more than income. It was identity. I found a studio apartment not far from downtown, clean, modest, with good light and a small balcony. I paid the deposit in cash and asked them not to list my name on the tenant registry. The woman at the front desk didn't ask questions. She only handed me the keys. I furnished it minimally. A bed, a small table, a second-hand armchair with just enough where to feel human. I stocked the kitchen with basics. It felt nothing like the house I'd shared with David for 26 years, and that was exactly the point. This was mine. Quiet. Blank. Untouched. I began moving things in slowly: a sweater, a book, a photograph. Nothing noticeable missing from the main house. Nothing to tip him off. At home, David became agitated in subtle ways. He didn't ask directly, but I could feel his attention sharpening. He began making idle comments about being so dependent and how much things would fall apart without you. He'd never spoken like that before. Not when I was truly caring for him. This wasn't gratitude. This was fear disguised as charm. Margaret, his sister, began calling more often too. Her voice always clipped, always ending with the same edge. "How are you doing, really?" I said I was fine. I always said that. What I didn't say was that I knew she'd been forwarding David's messages. That Naomi had traced the number on one of the suspicious payments back to Margaret's old client account, a name I hadn't heard in years, but one that shouldn't have appeared on our bank statements. I wasn't surprised. David had never been the kind of man to confide in others. But control is easier when you outsource it to people you trust. Or think you can. One evening, I tested him. I left for my studio earlier than usual, saying I was attending a book club meeting. I didn't return until nearly midnight. When I walked in, David was in bed, lights off, television on, the tray from his dinner untouched. "You're late," he said, his voice neutral. Was I? I set my bag down, removed my shoes, walked to the kitchen. Poured myself a glass of water. He didn't ask where I'd been. He asked if I had fun. I said yes. The next morning, he was unusually pleasant. Offered to help me with breakfast prep. Complimented my blouse. Asked, in passing, if I'd still be home next weekend, just wondering, in case Margaret visits. I smiled and said I wasn't sure. I'd let him know. That was when I knew I had tipped the balance. Because David was reacting, not directing. For the first time in years, I was the variable he couldn't account for. He tried new tactics, small guilt trips, comments about the future, asking about my health, even bringing up our son. Mark wants to come visit. Maybe next month. As if invoking family would bind me to this version of our life. I nodded. Said it sounded nice. But inside, the separation was complete. The studio apartment was ready. My trust was funded. The legal transfers were complete. The investigative report was sealed. And I had begun withdrawing my caregiving duties, not harshly, but by reintroducing agency. I think you can manage that today, I'd say. Or, let me know if you really need help. I stopped anticipating. I stopped intervening. He noticed. There was tension in his shoulders, in the way he gripped the arms of the wheelchair. There was a sharper tone to his voice, a flicker of panic behind his eyes when I lingered too long outside the room. He asked more questions. Monitored more details. Tried, gently at first, then more insistently, to reassert control. But it was too late. I wasn't angry anymore. I wasn't confused. I was done. The change in him wasn't sudden. It came like weather, a shift in air pressure, a darkening of the sky. He didn't accuse me outright. He wasn't stupid. But he began testing the fences, pressing gently to see where the boundaries had moved. The man who once asked nothing of me beyond his needs now started asking questions, vague at first, carefully framed. "You've been out a lot lately," he said one morning while I buttoned his shirt. "It's good that you have a life outside this house." His tone was light, but his eyes didn't match. I met them in the mirror and smiled faintly. "Thank you," I said, smoothing the fabric at his collar. "I think so too." He didn't press further that day. But the testing continued. At breakfast, he asked if I still read the paper every day. If I still liked mystery novels. If I'd seen any old friends recently. Each question posed as casual interest, but I could feel the calculation behind it. Like he was inventorying me. Trying to determine which version of me he was dealing with, the woman he could anticipate, or the woman who had learned to answer softly while making moves he couldn't track. Margaret's visits became more frequent. She used to come once every few months, short stays, always scheduled, always full of feigned warmth. Now she started dropping in unannounced. Just in the neighborhood. Just checking on her brother. She brought casseroles and criticism. Told me I looked tired. Suggested I hire more help. At our age, it's hard to do everything alone. I said nothing. I served her coffee. I listened while she reminisced about their childhood and implied that I'd never really understood David the way family did. I nodded when she mentioned how isolated he must feel with me gone so often. "You've always been independent," she said one afternoon, stirring sugar into her mug. "That's good. But sometimes I wonder if you forget how fragile he really is." I tilted my head, pretending to consider her words. "Do you think he's fragile?" She blinked, caught off guard. "Well, yes. Of course." "I don't," I said. "I think he's quite capable." I watched her process the remark. The shift in posture. The way she held her cup a little tighter. Margaret never asked outright, but I knew she sensed something. Sisters always do. She saw the quiet way I moved now, the deliberation in my choices. And David, even if he hadn't told her anything directly, had likely spoken enough in code for her to piece together a version of the truth. Still, she tried to play her role. The concerned in-law. The loyal sibling. She offered to help with household decisions if I felt overwhelmed. Suggested I give her a key, just in case. I smiled politely and declined. She didn't push, but the suggestion lingered like smoke. David's tone began to shift, too. The charm, once easy, began to feel forced. When I asked him if he needed anything, he started saying things like, "No, I wouldn't want to burden you," or, "I'm sure you have more important places to be." I never defended myself. I didn't reassure. That was the shift that truly unsettled him, not my absence, but my silence. The things he said next came carefully veiled. "You know, I've been thinking about the will," he mused one night while I folded laundry nearby. "It might be time to update some things. Don't want any surprises down the line." I didn't look up. "That's your decision," I said simply. He paused. "I mean, we've built this life together." I folded another towel. "Yes," I said. "We have." It was like trying to trap fog. He couldn't quite name what he feared, so he circled it with insinuation. But I didn't take the bait. Every comment, every probing glance, I met with that same unshakable calm. He began watching me more closely. I felt it in the stillness of the house, the way the air shifted when I entered a room, the faint hush that followed when I turned my back. I stopped leaving my notebooks in the closet. I no longer left keys in the dish by the door. I placed a lock on my file cabinet and said it was for tax documents. He didn't ask for the key. He started asking about Mark. Our son. He never used to, they weren't close. But now, his questions came like feelers. "Have you heard from Mark lately?" "A few weeks ago," I said. "Did he mention me?" "No," I said. "Not really." Silence stretched between us. Later that night, he mentioned how important family is. How difficult it must be for Mark to live so far away, how he wished we'd all been closer. I didn't answer. Not because I was angry, because I saw what he was doing. He was laying the groundwork for something. Trying to build a bridge to loyalty he could no longer summon from me. Then came the moment I'd anticipated. "I was thinking," he said one evening, too casually, "maybe we should get someone to help out. A companion for me. You've been so busy lately, I don't want you to feel guilty leaving." I sipped my tea. "You've never needed a companion before." "Well," he said, "maybe it's time." I nodded. "If that's what you'd like." He hesitated. "Would you help me find someone?" "No," I said, setting my cup down. "I think you're capable of doing that yourself." He stared at me then, openly. The mask dropped for a second, and I saw the flicker of something beneath it, not anger, not fear exactly, but calculation. The math of someone trying to reconcile a new variable. He didn't ask again. Instead, the next week, he arranged for Margaret to visit for a full weekend. She stayed in the guest room and spent most of her time in the kitchen, clucking over dinner prep and laundry as if to prove some silent point. On Sunday morning, I found her in the study, going through the desk drawers. She claimed she was looking for stamps. I said nothing. I let her find what she found, which, by then, was very little. The real documents were gone. Locked in a separate location. Copied and distributed to Marcy, to a secure deposit box at the bank, to Naomi's office. David sensed the shift. He didn't speak of it directly, but I saw the consequences in his movements. He became restless. Short-tempered. He knocked over a glass of water one afternoon and accused me of placing it too close to the edge. When I didn't react, he deflated, apologized, said he was just tired. I nodded and left the room. That was the hardest part, the way he tried to return to the old roles. The apologies, the small gestures. The carefully worded regrets. They came not from guilt, but from necessity. He was trying to rebuild what he thought was salvageable. But the foundation was gone. I wasn't angry anymore. Not in the way he expected. I didn't want revenge. I didn't want confrontation. I wanted distance. Clean, unshakable distance. He couldn't find his footing in that space. He tried one last tactic, a surprise dinner. Margaret helped. They set the table with candles, pulled out the good china. David had ordered food from my favorite restaurant. He even played the song from our wedding. When I walked in, I paused. Looked at the scene. Margaret was already seated, beaming, and David, sitting a little too straight in his chair, said, "Thought we could have a special evening. Just the three of us." I sat down. Ate the food. Smiled politely. When they asked what I'd been doing with my days, I spoke of books, walks, coffee with friends they didn't know. I watched them both realize they had no place in that world. When dinner ended, David reached for my hand. "I miss us," he said. I looked at him for a long moment. "There is no us," I said gently. "Not anymore." Margaret opened her mouth to speak, but I stood up and began clearing the dishes. David didn't follow. Margaret didn't protest. Because something had shifted in the room. I had nothing left to defend. The last morning I spent in that house was ordinary in every visible way. I made oatmeal. Watered the plants. Loaded the dishwasher. From the outside, there would have been nothing to notice, no suitcases by the door, no tense goodbyes or dramatic announcements. Just a quiet kitchen, a soft radio in the background, and the hum of the refrigerator. I had already moved out most of what mattered. Bit by bit, over weeks. I'd left behind enough to keep the illusion intact: clothes in the closet, a book on the nightstand, my slippers under the bed. David wouldn't realize I was gone until long after I'd left. I left the keys in the drawer by the sink. The house was his now, in the ways that counted. I had already signed over joint ownership of the property. Let him keep it. The mortgage was long paid off, and I no longer cared about the walls or the memories they held. The house had become a symbol of his stage. I no longer wanted to perform there. I stepped outside into the cool morning. The car was packed, just a few bags, a small crate of books, my notebooks, the lockbox. I didn't take photos or keepsakes. I didn't need them. I had the truth, and that was enough. I drove without looking back. The studio apartment welcomed me with silence. It smelled like new paint and dust, and the light poured through the windows with a clarity that almost startled me. I unpacked slowly. Hung my coat on the back of the door. Made tea. Sat on the small balcony and listened to the city move around me. No one knew I was there. No one needed to. That afternoon, I visited Marcy's office one last time. "It's all finalized," she said, handing me the final copies. "The trust, the account restructuring, the separation documents. If he contests anything, we have the timeline, the evidence, the financials. You're protected." I nodded, signing where she indicated. "There's something else," she added, sliding over a smaller envelope. "From Naomi. She wanted you to have this." Inside was a printed report, the final findings from the last weeks of surveillance. Details about David's contacts, the continued payments to the woman we'd identified as his so-called care consultant, emails suggesting he was planning to move funds offshore. He'd been preparing, in his own way. Preparing for a fight, maybe. Or for a life without me, one where he could control the narrative. It no longer mattered. I placed the report back into the envelope, tucked it into my bag, and thanked Marcy. From there, I walked to the park nearby. Bought a sandwich from a vendor. Sat on a bench under a maple tree just starting to turn. Around me, people passed by, mothers with strollers, teenagers with skateboards, elderly couples walking hand in hand. Nobody looked at me. And for the first time in years, I felt like I belonged in my own life. The apartment settled around me easily. I found a rhythm: mornings with tea and a book, afternoons with freelance work, evenings cooking small, thoughtful meals just for myself. I bought fresh flowers for the windowsill. picked up fabric to make curtains. Enrolled in a writing group at the community center, a small circle of women who met on Tuesdays to share stories and pages, laughter and silence. I wrote about everything but him. I didn't need to memorialize David. He had already taken more space in my life than he deserved. The fallout came eventually. I'd expected it would. 2 weeks after I left, I received an email from his lawyer. Curt, confused, demanding an explanation. David claimed abandonment. Claimed confusion. Said he was blindsided. I replied with a single sentence. All materials regarding Mr. Lawson's conduct are on file with Ms. Chang's office. I never heard from that lawyer again. Then came the messages. David, in emails and voicemails, swinging wildly between anger and pleading. He missed me. He needed me. He didn't understand. Couldn't I come back so we could talk? Didn't I want closure? No. I didn't. I'd spent years building a life around his needs. Around the illusion of his helplessness. I didn't need closure. I needed distance. And I had it. Margaret called once, left a message full of wounded pride and veiled threats. Said I'd betrayed her brother. Said I'd made everything harder than it needed to be. I didn't respond. Silence had become my ally, not as a retreat, but as a stance. A firm, unshakable boundary. The same woman who once explained herself to everyone now answered to no one. Mark called too, eventually. Our son. He'd heard from David, though he didn't share the details. Mom, are you okay? He asked, uncertain. I'm more than okay, I said. There was a pause. A long one. I didn't know things were that bad, he said quietly. I know you didn't. I should have paid more attention. You were busy, I said. With your own life. That's how it's supposed to be. He didn't argue. He didn't apologize. But 2 weeks later, I got a letter. Handwritten. 3 pages. Thoughtful. Reflective. Not a redemption arc, just an opening. An acknowledgement. I placed it in my desk drawer and wrote back. We weren't rebuilding, not yet. But we weren't strangers either. The studio became home in ways the house never did. It was quiet, yes, but it was my quiet. My decisions. My hours. No one watched the clock for me. No one monitored my steps. I went where I wanted, when I wanted. Took trains to nearby towns. Spent afternoons in museums. Learned how to make sourdough. Watched old films at the community cinema. I found myself craving nothing extravagant, just freedom. Spacious, ordinary, uninterrupted freedom. One evening, I sat on the balcony with a cup of tea, watching the street lamps flicker on. Below me, a woman walked her dog. A teenager rode past on a bike. In the apartment next door, someone was playing the piano, hesitant notes, learning scales. I didn't think of David. I thought of the version of myself I'd nearly lost, the woman who once had opinions, interests, rest. The woman who'd been buried under caregiving schedules and small humiliations, who had once believed that loyalty meant erasing oneself for another's comfort. She was back now. Not the same, older, sharper, quieter. But intact. People talk about freedom like it's loud. Like it's travel or reinvention or risk. But mine was soft. It was morning light on clean sheets. The sound of a kettle. A door that locked from the inside. A mailbox with only my name. David still lived in the house. I knew that. He'd hired a nurse, a real one this time. Margaret still hovered. The accounts had been frozen, but I'd left him enough. I didn't want revenge. I wanted clarity. I got it. In the end, there was no confrontation. No courtroom scene. Just the slow unraveling of a story he could no longer control. He was the author of that ending, not me. My life no longer ran parallel to his. I worked. I walked. I rested. I wrote. There was no triumph in it, not the kind people cheer for. But there was peace. There was strength. And in that separation, the word free finally belonged to me, not as his insult, but as my truth.